Hi, I am T.L. Cowan, and I am one of the many faculty involved with the FemTechNet learning experiment called DOC 2013, the Distributed Open Collaborative Course. And I want to welcome you today to a special dialogue session on the topic of quote-unquote bodies. In feminism, we do that with bodies. Before we get started, I also want to acknowledge that my body right now is being taped in on the island of Manhattan, or Mannahatta, which is the traditional territory of the Lenape people. Today I am very happily in conversation with two artists whose work can help us to think about some of the conceptual, aesthetic, and political places where bodies, feminism, and technology meet. And so now quickly I want to introduce my dazzling and accomplished interlocutors today. First, I'll introduce Skawanare, who is the winner of the 2011 Eiteljorg Contemporary Art Fellowship. Skawanare is an artist whose work addresses history, the future, and change. Since 1996, she's been working in new media, which means you've been on the internet since 1996 or before, right?
Yes.
Yes, that's impressive to me. Beginning with the pioneering Aboriginally determined online gallery and chat space, Cyber Powwow, Skawanare is currently co-director with Jason E. Lewis of AbTech, Aboriginal Technologies in Cyberspace, a network of artists, academics, and technologists investigating, creating, and critiquing Aboriginal visual environments. She is Mohawk from Gananakwe, and her great-grandfather, importantly, for the embodied context that we have here today, built the Empire State Building.
Not by himself.
Not by himself. The others. Also, we have here today Heather Castles, who uses the physical body as sculptural mass with which to rupture societal norms. Castles received an MFA in 2002 for Art and Integrated Media from the California Institute of the Arts in Los Angeles. Castles was recognized by the Huffington Post as one of 50 transgender icons. And Castles was also awarded many awards, including the Long-Term Support for Visual Artists Grant from the Canadian Council of the Arts in 2012 to 14, the Visual Arts Fellowship from the California Community Foundation, 2012. Castle's work has been featured in many museums and galleries around the world, including the National Theatre Studio as part of the Spill International Festival of Performance, J. Paul Getty Museum's Pacific Standard Time at LACE, Utah Museum of Contemporary Art, the Anti-Contemporary Art Festival in Finland, and Yerba Buena Art Center for the Arts in San Francisco in 2008. Castle's large-scale studio solo exhibition, Body of Work, is currently open at the Ronald Feldman Fine Art Gallery in New York till this Saturday, October 12th, 2013. So, welcome, Castles and Skawanare. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm just going to jump right in and start with a bit of a choose-your-own-adventure question. I want to begin by asking you just simply how the feminist bodies, quote-unquote bodies, function in your work. So how you use or make bodies in your work, and also just maybe a little bit of a story about how you became interested in doing work on bodies or making bodies as part of your art practice.
It's interesting because I was actually trained as a painter, as a visual artist. But somewhere along the lines, I became sort of frustrated with limits to which you could hang things on the walls and have things be looked at. And so I became very interested in the sort of the performative actions of the body. And so I started to, and then I think also, as I was saying earlier, my double life is I've got a former career as an athlete, and I run a training business. And so it seemed just kind of common sense for these things to start overlapping and informing each other. But that being said, I ended up doing a series of works where there would be absolutely nothing left. Like I made a piece called Tiresias, which involved a knife sculpture, and the remnant would be a bucket of water, and I'd be like, yeah, check out my anti-capitalist bucket of water. But then, it came around to this notion of realizing, well, if there's nothing left to be seen, then how does that hold the work in a larger sort of historical context? And this is something I've been thinking of in dialogue with other sort of academics who are writing about forgotten queer histories and in doing works around archiving practices. Once again, I've started to make these more materialized objects that then can kind of expand and tell a story. And in terms of a sort of a feminist practice, certainly one of my reasons, the only reason I was drawn to Los Angeles was for CalArts' history of Woman House. So studying with some really interesting professors there, including Kashila Brooke and Millie Wilson, Michael Asher. This kind of deepened my informed practice. I'd say one of my greatest inspirations and touchstones in my work is Adrian Piper's work, and maybe not really considered necessarily a feminist, but still that kind of a position of outsiderness, though maybe we could call it a queer position. The works of David Wojnarowicz also definitely informs my practice.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's where you came to.
Yep.
From.
Yeah.
Thank you, Skawanati.
I didn't think of my own work as being about bodies or making them, but I sort of come to realize that you can't escape your body, even though people try to in cyberspace. So I guess I wanted to talk a bit about, come back to cyberpower a tiny bit, because before that I talked a lot about identity, about being a Native person and a non-Native person at the same time. I did think a lot about being a woman and what that meant, what sex means, both when I say what it means, like talking about the language, like talking amongst people, but also kind of legally, like what it means to be a woman and what it means to be an Indian and what, these kind of words and ideas. But I moved into the cyberspace thing a little bit, it was a feminist organization that got me in there, I suppose, that I was already interested in digital art, thanks to a teacher at school, at university. But I went to this evening. There were several evenings called Wired Women Evenings by Studio XX in Montreal, which is a production artist-run center for teaching women how to use technology and producing it, helping them to produce it. And so this one presentation, this one night, was on the Palace, this graphical chat room. And back at this time, in 1995, chat rooms were just these astounding things. I mean, this was like, we are living in the future now because I can talk to someone in real time on this computer for free. It was really amazing. And so I went to this presentation on the Palace, and now not only were you able to talk to people in real time for free anywhere in the world, but there was a picture with it. It was a graphical chat room so that you were represented by this thing called an avatar, which of course was a brand new word for me. And in fact, with the Palace, the default avatar was a little smiley face, just like from the 70s. Well, you've seen it's from every time now. So I saw this Palace as a great way for Native people, like the Native artists that I had started to meet, who didn't live near me. They weren't geographically close to me, but they were close to me in that we were all talking about the same types of things. And I was like, oh wow, this is how we can talk to one another now, even though we're spread across this continent. And so I started Cyber Powwow. And one of the first questions, so kind of back to the question of bodies, was, well, how are people going to know who's Native and who's not in this palace? You're all wearing avatars. You can't tell, And so our response, because I worked with other artists, was let's just put a whole bunch of Native avatars in there. And so we threw in, stereotypical Native person. Like maybe there was one that was a woman who was she actually won like Miss Native America. So she was like this beautiful braided, beaded lady. And then there was Tank Girl, when she wears her Native costume, like she does it's now called red face, like it's a thing that's happening right now again. We had the plastic little Indian, like cowboy Indian guy. We had all these different things. And then we had some even pictures of ourselves, and we had smiley faces. it was sort of like, I'm going to just trouble this idea or play with this idea of who's Native and how you can tell that they're Native.
I want to move into another question that's kind of connected to a video dialogue that aired just this last week, so at the beginning of October. The dialogue on the theme of race, the moderator, Ann Balsamo, asked Maria Fernandez and Lisa Nakamura how the topic of race intersects with topics of feminism and technology. And Maria Fernandez gives this really brilliant answer. She explains that race and gender can be considered as technologies insofar as they are what she calls a series of techniques that have been historically used to establish differences, hierarchical differences, among people. So that's what Fernandez says. And so this leads me to my next question for both of you, which I think will allow you to elaborate on what you've begun. which is I'm wondering if you can talk about how your work takes up race or gender as technologies that make or differentiate bodies. So your work itself as a kind of technique, but also how you engage with bodies themselves as technologies and use other forms of technology, technique, computer programming, weight training, and other art practices to foreground these processes or techniques. And so really it's a question about process and really about this idea of all of the kind of multiple ways that bodies and technology are kind of co-animating and are in many ways the same thing.
So embodied knowledge, race and gender. Um, this is just randomly, slightly off topic. It's making me think of a personal training client I have who is a Korean-American actor who got cast in a Star Trek film. And he was having a lot of anxiety about this sort of stereotype around an Asian American male and appearing small or kind of facilitating or contributing to certain stereotypes. And so it was interesting for me as his trainer in Hollywood to kind of like think about these notions of race in terms of a material read on flesh. And so the two of us like spent a lot of time talking about this. And I was like, well, let's use the knowledge of sports science to kind of turn those notions and expectations on their head by kind of constructing a physique that would kind of go against that stereotype, you know? Mm-hmm. So I guess there's like a kind of way in which we can kind of construct sort of flesh, and once again, as I'm talking in terms of, I guess, the cuts piece, it's very much about turning on its head the sort of expectations of what a male or a female body looks like, much like in I guess becoming an image. Part of my training protocol was to train for MMA, which is mixed martial arts. And in order to do that, I had to completely change my training regime. I had to lose muscle. I had to gain flexibility and power and speed. And part of what I do kind of to geek out is I research other athletes' kind of training protocols. And there's a kind of a female MMA champion. She's like the world champion. She's also a 3-time judo Olympian named Ronda Rousey, who right now is the current record holder for MMA and UFC fighting. And it just happens that she trains 10 minutes from my house. So I've started to train at her gym. And part of the reason I've started to do that is because when I was picked up to fight semi-pro as a boxer, I was training next to this Mexican lightweight champ. I'd been picked up at 20 or something. He'd been training since he was 5. So the sort of physical ability of his aptitude was much greater than mine because I had been picked up so late. So I didn't want to be good for a, quote, girl. I wanted to be good. And when you look at Ronda Rousey, she has this incredible prowess that is just a mastery of form. So part of what I'm interested in doing is kind of embodying not only a physical sort of read in terms of a surface of the body, but also just kind of making, when you see a live performance, when you see the action, when you see the power, kind of making people question their assumption about what bodies can have what kinds of physical power. And then in terms of, I guess, in terms of race, I guess I could think about, when I'm thinking about becoming an image, I'm talking about erasure. So I'm talking about not just like missing, I'm talking about the exclusion of history. So we could be talking about, I mean, we all know that there is incredible amounts of many types of people and individuals, gendered, racial, across the board. People have been excluded from history. And so I think it's pointed that, and then also if we're talking about those silence, violence, I mean, people like transgender people of color are 2 times more likely to experience these acts of violence. So these, I mean, all of these things kind of fold into each other and on top of each other.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and it also makes me think about the cuts of traditional sculpture, and you have the images that you take every day, and that those are, you know, part of the installation, but then you also have the video that shows the ways that you're producing that body and the ways that that you're kind of denaturalizing the way, like, you know, showing the way that that body is, you know, intensely disciplined and, as you say, kind of destructive, not just productive,
of course,
but also destructive.
Yes, I'm replicating something in society. I'm certainly not trying to posit that my way is the right way. You know, it is a way that I do things, but I try to very much kind of dismantle and unpack the mechanism of that, to kind of reveal And I do that not only in the kind of performative act, but in the act of making images as well in certain pieces. For example, in the performance Hard Times, you're very aware of the gaffing, of the lighting cues, of the way in which the light is affecting your read of the image. This is a romantic light. This is an overhead space alien invasion light. This is making me scared. This is making me think glamour. So really kind of unpacking the sort of industrialized production of images.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Skawanati, this is, again, it's a question kind of about embodied knowledges, and I was thinking about the ways that you're talking about Aboriginal determined space, place in cyberspace, but also about the kinds of bodies that you're putting into that space. And I'm really curious about the way that you say, let's make all the avatars indigenous, make them all native, and then what happens to that when we think about the ways that when we think about embodied knowledge and what does it mean to create these avatars in the ways that you're making them. And I'm also curious about, you talk about like the t-shirts and the accessories and the other things that you make for these avatars.
Well, first of all, when we started in I'll jump back to Second Life now in Time Traveler. When we started making the characters, we realized that there was like not very much brown skin in Second Life, because that was that was 5 years ago. There's a lot more now, but that was like, oh wow, So I had to find ways to find the brown, the color of the skin that I wanted. And I mean, so in Imagining Indians, as some of you have seen, I made her very fair on purpose. I want to play with the idea of skin color and how that matches or doesn't match being Native or being Mohawk in this case, I guess. So even finding like even the color that I was looking for was hard to find. But I mean, it was interesting to realize I had a color, or I mean, to really things. You have this embodied knowledge, and then when you're making your artwork, that's what helps you to start to articulate what is actually going on here in your mind. And if it's happening in your mind, it's probably happening. It's happening at different levels of consciousness amongst the greater population. So what I wanted to do in Time Traveler Tim was have these different colored people, but I wanted you to know that they were Native. And so some of the things that I did was I created what I call Native signifiers. And so that's what you mean by the t-shirts. So if you noticed in episode 6, Hunter wears a couple of different t-shirts. He has like an AIM t-shirt. I call those, I have actually special name for his series of t-shirts, the distressed effin' punk t-shirts. So effin' sounds like fucking, but it's also First Nations, stands for First Nations, so it's a little play on words for myself. And like, it's supposed to look like kind of like these were Native t-shirts that might be from, the past, and he's worn them for a lot, and they're like kind of messed up. But, that's something that Native people do, like to tell each other apart, kind of. They'll put on these t-shirts that are like a powwow t-shirt, or you've all seen the great big wolf in the sky kind of t-shirt, So that was one of the things that I thought was a way to do it. There's hair. So especially when we go back in the past, it was impossible in Second Life to find braids. So we had to figure out how to make them, and we did. And, but again, the skin colors, and then, because they're less, here's the technology that she talks about, but because they're less, mixed with non-Native or mixed with dark skin, less mixed, those people I thought should be darker, those characters in the those periods. So had to find the darker skins, and had to find, also I wanted to make sure that there were things that I wanted to depict people as they probably were at the time. So for example, in episode 2, it's taking place after there's a lot of settlers around, and there was a great mixture of clothing at that time. People, like Native people, would be wearing, a lot of beaded stuff, but they'd also be wearing a lot of like shirts with buttons, that were made by, similar to those that were made by the settlers. So I've got that kind of thing. Like, it's funny because in that episode, we have a white settler who has a gun, and we have a Native person who has a gun, and his gun is natified because it's got like feathers hanging from it, Like it's really interesting to like start to call these things out. Like when you're making a set, you realize that every single thing in the set is chosen and deliberate. And so, and you have to also say so much. You have to use these visual cues to say stuff. You know, each of these episodes took months and months to create. And so I wanted to really create kind of shorthands. I'm sure, I don't know the film industry that well, or even films that well, but I think that this is something that is a very important skill to have when you're making the film, is to, what does the thing on the desk mean? What are the items that are going to be in the room? And so, so even with the room, I felt the need to, I chose certain things that I think would be very familiar to a lot of Native people to see, and then I wanted to open that up also to to people who didn't know what a Native bedroom looks like, maybe.
Right.
I wanted
Right.
that to be in there.
And I have a million other questions for both of you, but I suspect that you might have questions, or because I'm thinking of that there's like, a lot of things that are similar about your practices, or that your practices kind of speak to each other. And I'm just wondering if you want to, respond to each other at this point at all.
It's just funny because as you're talking, I was like, oh, should I jump in here? But no, I'll just wait, But I mean, it is great to find the connection there that I think you saw all along, of the way we're trying to find kind of new languages and new spaces. The archive, which I never called my practice. I never talked about the archive, but I do talk about this lack of imagery of Native people now, and the idea in the future. Of course, that's where I pull it from, but it's kind of similar. Like the archive of Native images is very similar.
Well, I think we're both seem to be interested in sort of self-determined production of images that are based on our kind of lack of what we see in the world, like wanting to create new forms of representation. And I think something that was interesting that we were talking about earlier before we came in here was we were just talking about existing in between sort of binaries or in between races, and how that kind of informs our practice. So I think that's an interesting overlap. Yeah.
And also, I think both of you are trying to make apparent in your work the kind of processes and negotiations of navigating through the ways that bodies get read into existing discourses, into existing appropriate understandings of what's appropriate and what's inappropriate based on gender or race or region or age, or all of these things that we find ourselves kind of compelled into.
But also methods of, I think
Yeah.
that really strikes me that I find really interesting about your work is this kind of, like your nod to capitalism, this like T-shirts that we have, and kind of branding yourself, like having, like thinking down to the T-shirt and the clothing that the characters are wearing. So kind of pointing to these mechanisms of consumption that create identities, like what is a colonized identity? Where does capitalism play into that? Like these are things that I think are really interesting about your practice.
Thank you. I try to, I'm happy that you see that as that, because that is part of what I'm trying, I allude to. It's like a kind of secondary or theme, but the idea that the capitalism and the consumerism has had an effect on who we call ourselves and what we are. It comes out in the T-shirts as well. It comes out in when you see the futuristic sets, there's like there's advertisements for everything, including Christianity. Like there's just like it's just everywhere bombarding you. Yeah.
I just want to maybe ask a specific question to each of you before we wrap up. And Kessels, I want to ask you just specifically about your own practice, and to talk about one of the things that I noticed in the practice, and especially in the Feldman show that I just went to see that's happening here in New York, is the tension between the still image and the performance, and also the mediation of photography and photography and the photographer really as both collaborator but also kind of animator of the work. But you're also kind of vulnerable to that photograph, especially in the becoming an image piece. And I'm wondering if you can just talk more specifically about your practice itself and potentially the tension between the still image or the document and the performance, but also just in terms of talking specifically about some of the work that I think really informs my understanding of where we're at in a contemporary moment, thinking about bodies in art practice and politics and aesthetics.
Well, I think my body is mutable, it's changing. It's not fixed, and the notion of a photograph is fixed. So the act of like changing the body to create a kind of plurality of identities is something that I'm interested in. In terms of that particular project, yes, it was informed by the One Archives, but the other thing it was informed by was a request to collaborate with an Italian photographer based in the UK named Manuel Vasson, who I love. He's a wonderful photographer. But most of his photographic process is made up of these works where he makes works with performance artists, live art practitioners. And he calls these works collaborations, but to me, a lot of his work reads as kind of fashion images of these artists' practices. And so Becoming an Image was also very much developed as a way to problematize his practice. Because although some of those images that I showed you look well framed, they're all accidental. So in fact, when he's going through the act of photographing me, I've really problematized his usual procedure. So it's an interesting thing. Whenever I perform this work, the photographer panics and is trying to figure out how they can use the flash to get some of their agency back. So in a way, it was about kind of reclaiming agency or problematizing the act of agency, because it's kind of a side note. It's not really necessarily what I consider to be part of my art practice, but just in dialogue with a friend and colleague who's been studying and writing books on Jack Smith and Ron Athey, Sherry Rose, and other artists, kind of talking about the difficulty to find some of these archives that maybe have been lost, or maybe perhaps some of these people have passed away and their archives have fallen into some crazy relative's hands or something like that. Just how tricky it is when you are the subject of a work, even if you have considered the lighting, the tone, the construction of the image, everything, unless you press that button, the copyright lies in somebody else's hands. So kind of really thinking about the agency behind that, because this is something that I've experienced as an artist working in other people's works. So this is, I think, like thinking about agency around the sort of ways that we have to kind of unpack this sort of power paradigm in terms of representation. And these are kind of like the kind of DVD extras or the behind the scenes things, but these are sort of things that I think about a lot in determining a sort of empowered practice that allows me to have continued agency.
Mm-hmm. And that reminds me a lot of the remote control shutter release that you have in your hand in all of the images in cuts,
right?
Which to me is an act of, well, self-portraiture, but it's and the kind of mediation of all of the kinds of building and technologies that are happening in that sculptural piece, but also about your own agency to take and own those images and that process too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I love the little flicker. I love the little clicker in those.
And that reminds me of the
images.
Vanessa Beecroft thing.
Right.
Yeah. So how did you? That's super interesting.
Oh man, Vanessa Beecroft. She's a thorn in my side.
Oh.
This is going on the internet now.
We're about to run out of time, but Skaunati, I want to just first of all acknowledge that the first time I saw you was when you were talking about the Abtech and the time travel, and I first saw the avatars that you were building and the amazing way that you talk about it, and I developed a huge crush immediately. And one of the things that I think is so brilliant about what you talk about is the importance of kind of bodies in context and the politics of self-determination in space. And you talk about aboriginally determined territories online. And I'm just curious if you could just say something about the process of, so you've kind of talked about populating these territories, but like making these territories and how that works kind of in a broader art context, like in terms of how you interact as an artist, as an online artist, as a digital media artist, but also kind of creating communities, or I mean, I don't like the word communities necessarily always, but I'm thinking about this idea of bodies in context and this self-determined territory.
I think I'll tell you about safe spaces, what I mean by safe spaces in cyberspace. I think, one of the things that I'm trying to do is to make sure that Native people kind of affect the look and feel of the place. I think it's, and I'm not actually 100% sure how, no, scratch that. this does fit into my art practice. You know, I think that when the camera came out and then the movie camera came out, you know, a lot of Native people mostly did not have any access to that technology. It was very expensive. There was you know, a lot to learn. In fact, the same is true about computers and about the internet. However, access seems to have occurred. Now there's a lot more Native people that do have access to these tools. But, you know, maybe there's no but there. Yes, there is a but there. The but is that I'm still not seeing, you know, a lot of Native people use them. You know, I think that there's a lot of playing of video games, but there's not that much making of the video games. There's not that much learning of how to, you know, how to use the technology. And so part of what I'm doing, I think it's a kind of, I definitely call it activism, part of an activist part of my work.
Yeah.
But it's also like a really slow kind of activism, you know what I mean? Of teaching people to how to be empowered, how to empower themselves. And so, so that's why there's Aboriginal territories in cyberspace. It's like this place, it's this network and a space, and you know, for people to come in and find ways to come in and make and be. Like that's what CyberPower was as well. When I first started, you know, when I saw it and learned how to use it from Studio XX, but then, well, and there's a lot of learning, self-learning with this kind of technology. But you know, when I invited the other artists to come in, I had to teach them how to do it before they could make the work that was ultimately seen in CyberPower.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Castles and Scalinati. That was a really fabulous way to think about bodies, feminism, and technology, but also to get to know both of your work a little bit more. And I will encourage people to also take a look at the video of their cyber studio visits that we have also recorded and that will be available online soon. And I think that's it. Thank you very much, and I look forward to continuing this conversation by following your work. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.